you, Sue. Hello, everyone. First of all, actually, I'm just going to check whether I've got control of the mouse or not. So, let's see. Hopefully, we should be seeing. There she is. Brilliant. This is BJORK. She's a pop star and an artist from Iceland. And in 1993, she wrote a song called Human Behaviour. And in it, she said this: "If you ever get close to a human and human behaviour, be ready to get confused. There is no map to human behaviour." Well, she would say that. She's the one wearing a swan. But she's got a point. Human behaviour is tough to figure out. If it wasn't, nobody would pay us any money. Market research has generally concerned itself with answering three main questions. What do people do? Why do people do it? What will they do next? It's not always been very good at answering these, but it's tried its best. Now, being on this webinar, obviously you're aware that there's a body of work which throws our ideas of human behaviour into even more doubt. And we tend to call this stuff behavioural economics, even though, as Ray Pointer and many others have pointed out, a lot of it isn't strictly behavioural economics at all. It's a mix of economics, social psychology, experimental sociology, and a lot of other behavioural science. And the behavioural science we've got excited about tends to be based on the vast literature of individual studies. And this gets translated into a corpus of immensely entertaining anecdotes, some of which I admit I'll be talking about in this presentation. But is this enough? Some think not. Economist and researcher Lee Caldwell made waves earlier this year when he compared researchers' grasp of behavioural economics to... hopefully we'll be seeing who. There she is, Kylie. In Lee's view, we're at an early Kylie stage with behavioural economics. Oh, wait a minute, there's Celine. Let's go back. In Lee's view, we're at an early Kylie stage with behavioural economics. Frothy, hugely popular, but getting a bit repetitive. He thinks we should try and move to late Kylie. Still popular, but more established, mature, not recycling the same old hits again and again. I think he's right. I'm not promising that this presentation will be anecdote-free. Anecdotes are still the best way to illustrate difficult concepts. But at BrainJuicer, we've been working on pulling together the various theories of behavioural science into a model of human behaviour, which will, we think, help clients understand people's behaviour better, and maybe reframe the questions researchers here to ask. Our model is underpinned by one particular thinker, and his insights into how we make decisions. And to introduce him, here's our third and final pop singer, Celine. There. Celine did the theme for Titanic, of course, very topical, but before that she had another worldwide hit, a power ballad called Think Twice. And thinking twice is central to our concept of consumer behaviour, because it's precisely what we don't believe people usually do. Think twice is a common phrase, practically a proverb. It means don't obey your impulses, think it through, check what you're doing. And we're all familiar with the feeling of doing it, having to stop ourselves, cogitate, think rationally, or what we imagine to be rationally. What's happening here, according to the Nobel-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman, is that your brain has two different systems for thinking about things. Kahneman has been talking about the dual process brain for years. This book, published last year, is the best introduction to his ideas. And according to Kahneman, System 1 thinking is considerably faster and requires less effort than System 2 thinking. As soon as you engage System 2, when you think twice, for instance, forcing yourself into conscious reconsideration of a decision, you're making a lot more effort. Here's an example, which you might have seen in BrainJuicer presentations before, of the systems in action. What's this collection of dots? The first time you see this, you're baffled. You've no intuitive System 1 way of telling what it might be, so you start trying to work it out with your System 2. A constellation, maybe, a map. But when people see the dots in motion, which we can't show you for technical reasons, in a fraction of a second they know exactly what it is, because it's a pattern they see every single day. It's a set of motion sensors attached to a human figure. You can see the head and shoulders, the arms, legs, pelvis, and so on. And once the dots freeze again, you have to make a conscious cognitive effort not to see them that way. So that's an example of System 1 getting something right. What happens when it gets stuff wrong? Here's a maths question. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? The answer is, of course, 5 cents. But most people say 10 cents because it's a plausible answer that comes to mind immediately, and it takes genuine effort to think the problem through. Actually, a colleague of mine asked this as a pub quiz question recently, and amazingly enough, he wasn't lynched. But even in that context, where it was clearly a trick question, and only one person on each team needed to get it right to persuade the others, only 2 out of 8 teams got it right. System 1 is very, very powerful. So this metaphor of the two systems underpins our model. System 1 decisions are fast. They're instinctive. In fact, they're implicit. You barely notice yourself taking them. They're born from emotion and experience rather than cognitive analysis. And they're also a lot more common. They account for most of what we do every day. But now take a look at these 2 lists of adjectives describing the two systems, and imagine that they're different sets of answers to a question. And the question is this: describe what it feels like to do a survey. Which set of answers is the more credible? You'd have to say it's the System 2 ones. It's slow, analytical, effortful, conscious. So that's why the System 1 and System 2 metaphor has become the basis for reinventing the whole way we look at research problems at BrainJuicer. Because the surveys we as an industry tend to use are System 2 tools, and the danger is they lead everyone, clients, researchers and respondents, into thinking people's decisions are System 2 as well. We've done a lot of work with developing tools which do get closer to fast System 1 decisions, but that can only get you so far. People often can't tell you much about their decision-making processes, because so much of their decision-making is implicit and fast and unconscious, and they misreport it in all sorts of ways. So eventually you have to do something different. You have to get out there and understand the context people are taking these decisions in. Here you see a brain, a very familiar brain, Homer Simpson's brain, on the cusp of taking an everyday decision, like whether to buy a Duff beer or not. What is the context of this decision? Well, as you can see, there in the middle is the environment he's taking the decisions in, Moe's Tavern, where Duff is in plentiful supply. But there's also the people he knows, whose behaviour he might be copying or reacting to, or who might be setting the social norms. And finally, this is all happening in his head, so there are a bunch of personal factors, like how thirsty or tired he is, to take into account. Environmental, social and personal factors. These are the 3 areas we believe influence System 1 decision-making. And so these are the areas we believe clients need to focus on. This is the framework for what we're calling our behavioural model, and you'll be seeing variants of this chart a lot in this presentation. We should point out here that the separation of environmental, social and personal factors here is only a conceptual split. It's there because we found it makes it easier for clients to consider their knowledge gaps and their options for action. During the decision-making process, all these factors are intertwined, so we're not proposing to put weights on them or anything like that. If you look at the model, you'll see there's a big green decision circle, and inside that are a number of things people do, ways to describe aspects of consumer behaviour. So, in response to their environment, people take in information sensorially. They make choices between options presented to them, and then they convert that information and those choices into doing stuff, acting. That A should in fact be act. And in terms of what's happening in terms of social activity, people see things other people are doing, they do things in order to be seen by other people, which we're calling sharing, and they copy stuff they've seen. And then in terms of what's happening inside their heads, they feel emotions, they do a lot of things automatically in response to those emotions, and occasionally they do actually think a bit. And then around the outside of the decision circle is the stuff we think brands or retailers or companies need to be aiming to do to affect those things. They can prime consumers sensorially, frame their choices, and then trigger an action. They can aim to be seen, shared, and copied. And they can make decision-making fun, fast, and easy. But the question is how? That's obviously what we're trying to answer for all our clients. And beneath the hood of the simple model is a toolkit of approaches and ideas we work through with them. A lot of these are best illustrated by existing psychological experiments. So let's go through our 3 areas and look at some examples of how you can affect behaviour and decisions. We've introduced each section with a well-known, very well-known to this audience, I'd suggest, book or 2, which serves as a kind of layman's introduction to the area. So in the case of environmental factors, it's Thaler and Sunstein's Nudge, a fashionable read among the political classes and something Crawford talked about in his presentation. If you have a degree of control over the environment your consumer makes decisions in, it turns out tweaking the sensory input can radically affect those decisions. This chart details an experiment run on a wine shop, which sold both French and German wine. The first chart shows French wine outselling the German wine by 5 to 1. The second chart shows German wine outselling the French stuff by 2 to 1. The wine didn't change. All that shifted was the music playing in the shop. When French music played quietly in the background, French wine sold like crazy. When the accordions were switched for oompa bands, German wine overtook it. Similarly, dramatic impacts have been recorded in smell-based experiments. In this one, Dutch people were told to eat a biscuit, a very crumbly biscuit, and hidden cameras recorded their hand movements while eating. When the room had a subtle scent of cleaning products, the number of times people wiped the table clean trebled. There's obviously commercial applications of this finding if you can locate the right scent. A couple of days ago, news broke that a Melbourne artist has synthesized the smell of Apple products being unboxed for an exhibition. You can imagine some of the applications there. And as well as sensory input, it's possible to influence decision-making by altering the choices people are faced with. One of the most famous case studies in Nudge looks at the startling differences in organ donation rates after fatal car accidents. In several countries, the rates were very low. In the Netherlands, for instance, a large-scale campaign encouraging people to fill in donor cards only managed to push the rate to 1 in 4. But in other countries, uptake was almost universal. The key difference was how the choice was presented. If left as an opt-in, results were low. But if drivers had to specifically opt out and say, no, I don't want to donate, very few did. In the public policy arena, this kind of choice manipulation has become a flashpoint for people critical of nudge-style liberal paternalism and indeed behavioural economics in general. And while not all changes to the choice environment have such dramatic results, shifting the context of choices is still a very valuable tool, especially in areas like pricing or promotional options. Moving on now to the social dimension, and the books we're recommending here are both by Mark Earls, no stranger to the NewMr stage. In Herd, and his new book, I'll Have What She's Having, he outlines why copying other people is such a powerful force, and how you can use it to understand your market. They're highly recommended. And there's plenty of evidence for social factors as a powerful force in behaviour. This chart, which is taking its time to appear, here we are. This chart shows an experiment done using an honesty box, where people were asked to pay whatever they felt appropriate for a pint of milk. Above the honesty box was a picture which changed every week. In some weeks the picture showed flowers, in some weeks the picture showed eyes. On average, people paid almost 3 times as much when the picture showed eyes, giving them the subconscious sense they were being observed. Copying other people is an innate human trait. This next experiment involved a pretzel seller on a German train and their secret accomplices. Come on, pretzels, there we go. In unaltered conditions, 1 in 12 passengers bought pretzels, but when other people were seen to buy pretzels, or walk through the carriage carrying pretzels and eating them, and saying things like, yum, pretzels, the rate of purchase as much as doubled. You don't need the physical presence of other people either. Their implied presence can be enough. If you ask people whether they recycle and then track the ones who say they don't, surprise, they don't. If you send them communications about recycling, you'll see an uptick in the number of people doing it, but then that trails off as the weeks go by. If, on the other hand, you get them to make a pledge of intent, a public commitment, the uptick in behaviour stays fairly constant. Other people, therefore, act as a spur to behaviour in terms of copying or displaying particular choices, but their presence acts as a limiter too. Public commitments, like the recycling one, and the need to remain consistent in your public behaviour can have a big effect on choices. And finally, we have the personal behaviours, the internal heuristics and cognitive biases covered by Dan Ariely in his best-selling books. We're in the classic behavioural economics territory here of apparent irrationality, misjudgments and mispredictions, vast gulfs between reported activities and actual behaviour. Take, for instance, diversification bias. This essentially describes an effect where when we predict what we're going to do, we build in a lot more variety than we actually need. The experiment we see here is about choosing films. participants had the choice of highbrow or more populist films. When they chose a film to watch that day, the number of people picking the art house films was fairly constant, between 40 and 50%. But when people were told to pick films in advance, planning a menu of films if you like, the proportion choosing art house material shot up. Over 70% of people thought that by day 3 they'd be ready for some culture. The misprediction of what we actually want has big implications for shoppers. The very common budgeting advice to plan menus in advance, for instance, can easily run afoul of diversification bias, as you end up with a lot of food you only thought you'd want. Another common behavioural mechanism we fall foul of is consumption momentum. Imagine you've been given a big tub of chocolates. You open them on the day you get them and start eating. What happens? Well, most people eat the majority of the chocolates on day 1. But the curve of chocolate consumption can be altered significantly by one simple change. Individually wrapped chocolates are eaten more steadily and the curve is smoothed. This is because the act of unwrapping interrupts the momentum of consumption. Every wrapper you're faced with is another opportunity to stop. One bad habit people thinking about behavioural science fall into is the idea that all this stuff only applies to other people. The weak-minded, perhaps, or simply the stupid. It might be appropriate for certain basic consumption occasions, but it can't tell us anything, surely, about occasions where considered decisions are needed. Except, of course, it can. This final experiment was conducted on parole judges in Israel, people who really ought to be able to cogitate in a considered fashion. But when their decisions were examined, the proportion of prisoners they gave parole to varied in a predictable fashion. It plummeted before meal times and leapt up after. The reason is simply that, as Kahneman says, performance suffers under increased cognitive load. When the judges were tired and hungry, decision-making needed more energy and effort, and they were more likely to default to the easy decision, which in this case was to keep the prisoner locked up. So this collection of examples, heuristics, biases is by no means exhaustive. A 20-minute presentation can't cover the ground of a half-day workshop. But there you have the anecdotes. Now, how do we turn them into action? Well, looking at all these, you might see that they have 3 things in common. Firstly, none of them involved asking people questions. They involved setting up experiments, changing particular elements, and seeing what happened. We're trying to affect System 1 behaviour here, so it's often subconscious or implicit decisions, which means conventional research is of more limited use. Secondly, a lot of them might have been surprising to brand managers, but probably would have been entirely obvious to people working in sales or the shop floor, or even to shoppers. The degree of the impact of pretzel eaters or French music is remarkable, but the fact of it wouldn't necessarily surprise people on the consumer front lines. And the third thing they have in common is that everything discussed involves changing or testing small variable elements. It sounds obvious, but this is one of the most important parts of doing behavioural work, we think. There's a real difference between the things you can change and the things you can't. So in this chart, we've got our model in our decision circle, and on the inside of the circle there are all the things you might be trying to affect. Sensory priming, for instance, or encouraging social commitment, or pitching things to particular visceral states. And outside the circle are the more deep-lying factors, the regulatory environment, for example, or deeper cultural assumptions and norms, or people's upbringing and educational level. Now, the important thing about these deeper factors is that you can understand them. In fact, you have to understand them if any of your experiments are going to make a difference, in order to know what things to change. But you can't actually change the deeper factors directly. They're not actionable in the same way the things inside the circle are. So we think understanding these things is one area where traditional research is incredibly useful, but it can only take you so far. So there's our map of human behaviour. Understanding System 1 thinking by exploring the environmental, social and personal factors that underpin decision-making. Contrary to what BJORK says, it's really pretty simple. But what does it all mean for research? I said earlier that research has been about asking a few important questions. What do people do? Why do they do it? What will they do next? And we think that our behavioural model helps reframe these questions. What do people do? Well, this one stays the same, except we think you understand it more by observing or analysing real data than asking, if at all possible. But the next step is rather different. Why people do it is only as interesting as what can we change about people's behaviour. We use the various areas of the behavioural model to look at what aspects of decision-making, the environmental, social and personal context, brands can actually control or alter. Which might they focus on? And here's where you really have to start tapping your base of sales knowledge, user experience knowledge, everything that gets you away from the abstract. And then finally, the third question. What happens if we change these things? And this is the most crucial stage of all, designing experiments that help you understand what happens when you change particular factors. And once you've started doing that, in a structured way with real knowledge goals in mind, you're well on your way to realizing the potential of behavioural science for your company. Thank you.